Imagine a world without oil. How would we be affected? Did you know that there was an online game designed to explore exactly that theme back in 2007, a decade ago? The tagline for the website was, "Play it before you live it." Designed as a collaborative simulation of a global oil shortage, and as a massively collaborative imagining of the first 32 weeks of a global oil crisis, it provided an alternative reality chronicled online in 15,000 personal blog entries, videos, voicemails, and images that became, quote, "a serious game for the public good," end quote, and future-changing experience. Critics called it an alternate reality game with a conscience, a raging success contributing to positive social change, end quote. The video accompanying it darkly welcomed us to a world without electricity, heat, travel, cars, plastic, champagne, security, stability, caviar, oil. It underscored the reality that all of these things that we take for granted and more are currently dependent on oil. The game was intended to open our eyes and infect our minds with realities and possibilities as we attempt to transition to a net zero carbon future. And it used the mantra that has gained popularity since Buckminster Fuller's World Game and the Club of Rome's computer simulations of the limits to growth that, quote, "the best way to change the future is to play with it first." The idea was to collect the stories of people living in a world without oil, and through the simulation come up with solutions and getting them out there. Some people posted pictures, some created comics, some simulated novellas, and it brought people together from all corners of the globe engaged in an exercise for imagining the future so we don't have to live it. The players simulated the changes they would like to see in their own lives, rather than merely in a computer simulation environment. The 60,000 participants from around the world showed that in the context of a game, people would engage in things they might never participate in their normal lives. Some players said that as a result of playing the game, they actually started using cloth bags at stores, walking more and driving less, turning off lights, recycling and becoming a different person. World Without Oil was part of the serious game movement that, quote, "intends more than entertainment for its players, generally aiming to teach or train, often by realistically simulating some aspect of a world system," end quote. There are business training games now, disaster preparedness games, flight or driving simulators, patients that help patients understand how their bodies are fighting an infection, says the website. And this notion fits in very well with systems thinking, because as the definition states, quote, "serious games allow players to test and experiment with systems, which leads to a better understanding of the relationships that comprise the system," end quote. An alternate reality game, or ARG, is an interactive transmedia narrative that evolves in response to what its players do. It uses the real world as a platform, often involving multiple media and game elements, to tell a story that may be affected by participants' ideas or actions. ARGs are typified by intense player involvement with a story that takes place in real time and evolves according to participants' responses, and with characters that are actively controlled by the game's designers, the ARG website says. ARGs generally rely on the internet as the central binding medium. ARGs are attracting attention because they've been able to engage large numbers of players in collaborative efforts to solve very difficult puzzles and challenges. Now, we've seen the effectiveness of ARGs in solving, for example, protein folding challenges, and in solving the molecular structure of retrovirus enzymes that opened the doors to new HIV or AIDS drug designs. But can they be used to solve the impending oil crisis? The fact that the game was played by people all over the world 10 years ago, and yet we are now using more oil than ever before, might tempt you to say no. Peakoil.com suggests that 2017 is, quote, "the year when the world economy starts coming apart," end quote, and shows that oil consumption has continued to rise since 2007, not fall. However, there is evidence in some places, most notably California, that energy use per capita is declining, giving us some hope. California has implemented its own appliance and building codes and championed progressive solutions for substituting conservation and renewable energy supplies for fossil fuels and been largely successful at creating a culture that fosters innovation. And there may be some correlation between the successes the state has had in reducing its dependency on fossil fuels and the number of people who engage in gaming and fantasy role-playing. After all, California beats all the other states by a significant margin. It could just be a correlation and not a regression, but it is interesting to speculate. For the fantasy of living without oil to become a reality, there need to be real solutions out there beyond hoarding food and supplies and building a wall around your property. Fortunately, there are. All of the things we associate with civilization that the game asks us to imagine living without, electricity, heat, travel, cars, plastic champagne, security, stability, caviar, all of them and more can be produced without oil. We associate them with the oil age because the abundance and cheapness of oil and the fact that the hydrocarbons that make it up were already processed into a compact, easily transportable energy in compound-dense form made it economical to rapidly achieve an explosion of innovation regarding various end products and end uses. But that doesn't mean we need oil to create these goods again. After all, oil is just life compacted, mostly plant matter with the odd dinosaur thrown in the mix. The hydrocarbon chains, the long molecular backbone of carbonate bonds with hydrogen atoms sticking out like the legs of a centipede, are found in all carbon-based life forms and are endlessly manipulated through ontogeny and phylogeny to create ever more complex molecules with spectacular properties. Long before we discovered oil and coal and so-called natural gas and other fossil sources of hydrocarbons, these complex molecules existed and were explored and exploited by human beings. Pitch and tar were used to repair boats in ancient Egypt. The sap of trees like rubber and other sticky, elastic, and flammable substances and plant oils were used for medicine, for lighting, for manufacture, for combustion. And there's nothing that can be made out of fossil hydrocarbons, the residuals of ancient plants, that cannot be made out of the residuals of existing living plants. It just may cost a little more in the present. So what is the real worry here? Are we standing up for the poor? Is that what this is all about? Are we collectively suffering angst that when oil runs out, only the rich will have access to the caviar and the champagne? I kind of wish the fear of the impending oil crises was one of social justice, because as soon as the oil is gone, clever chemists and businesswomen will simply substitute today's biomass for yesterday's and keep producing all the goods and services we've come to expect. Oh yeah, initially they will simply be more expensive until the machinery is adapted to new feedstocks and the processes are brought to scale. And then they'll be cheap, the way almost all goods that are mass manufactured become cheap. A professor of mine at UCLA, the economic geographer Dr. Michael Storper, wrote in his books, among them Worlds of Production and the Capitalist Imperative, about how the real drivers of World War I and World War II were what has become termed the underconsumption crisis. Apparently, the Industrial Revolution made mass production its own undoing as far as the capitalist class was concerned. Once machinery was invented, basically ever-evolving robots who can do work faster, cheaper, and with greater precision, the cost of labor plummeted. With the cost of labor, which has always been the major factor deciding price, ever declining, the cost of goods in a fully competitive market was also ever declining. And this meant one of four things. Either A, you must deal with the ever-shrinking profit margins, or B, you must regulate production and place limits on the supply so it doesn't outstrip demand, or C, you must increase demand by growing population, or D, you must destroy capital stock so that you constrain supply. The Eastern Bloc, under so-called communism, tried to place limits on supply through regulation and protectionism and inefficiencies. The Western Bloc, under so-called capitalism, decided to promote ever-expanding population, but got in trouble because of the demographic shift wherein people relieved of the burdens of being reduced to slave labor stopped having as many children. They then tried two different tactics: expand to new markets through imperialism, and when that fails to keep pace with the need for expanding profits, destroy capital stock so as to artificially reduce supply. Wars radically reduce capital stock and so act as a reboot, enabling capital accumulation to occur again. The 1% who have the most control over this game don't seem to particularly care which mechanisms are used as long as profits continue to accrue. They aren't the ones suffering the displacement or doing the dying, so they tend to echo the character played by Peter Sellers in the war movie How I Won the War, featuring John Lennon, when he says, "What we need is a good, clean killing." As for the majority, they shouldn't, in my opinion, really worry about running out of oil or the cost of goods made from living biomass, because mass production techniques will make them ridiculously cheap over time. And that time could be drastically shortened if the masses themselves got involved with mass production by studying STEM, science, and applying their knowledge, your knowledge. A world of tinkerers could transform plants and animals and microbes and fungi into everything we need in no time. The real limits to growth, to economic growth, are the rate of growth, the rate of biological growth, which in turn is limited by the amount of sunlight and surface area. These are the true limits to growth, because in order to build up a huge reserve of fossil hydrocarbons that can be exploited rapidly to manufacture all of the things we've come to depend on, took millions of years of concentrated sunlight accumulating beneath the earth at a density that we will never see again in our lifetimes. Oil and coal and fossil fuels, said the economist E.F. Schumacher, are like our savings account. They're capital stock, which we should only tap into for investments that yield high returns. They accumulate slowly over time, and when we've amassed enough, we want to use them to invest in things like buildings, education, infrastructure. You never tap into your savings account to get a haircut or to mow the lawn, Schumacher said. On the other hand, solar energy and its biomass derivatives are like income. They trickle in slow and steady and are meant to be used for daily needs. They are our checking account, which we try to balance with our income. Society has been exploiting its collective savings account to do all sorts of silly things that should only be done with the checking account's balance. We've burned our fossil reserves to drive to a fast food restaurant, burned them up to get to work every day, depleted our stocks and drained them down to blow dry our hair, when all along we had a checking account we could have used. The fears of believers in capitalism seem to be based on an appreciation for the glacially slow rate of capital accumulation in nature, and a reliance on fossilized natural capital to drive an economy that exploits that natural capital through labor, making it fungible and available to shuttle its value between financial capital and social capital and cultural capital and intellectual capital. It is feared that when we run out of the massive pools of stored capital stored in the fixed carbon of slow-growing trees and slow-cooking oil and gas and coal deposits and accretions of radioactive isotopes, our ability to keep civilization going will fail, and our society, like a house of cards, will collapse. Such people are afraid that the rates of capital production in nature in real time cannot match our demand. And this is because sunlight, the major driver of most energy systems, is diffuse. And despite the sun rising every day with a clockwork reliability, its intensity is unpredictable and intermittent. The same is said of its derivatives, wind and water power. We somehow forget that the Earth is also blessed with a constant rotary motion that also drives wind and water and waves, along with a moon that helps create constant tides, and has a nuclear core that is always hot and always produces steam. We somehow don't talk enough about how all the sources combined add up to more energy, clean, reliable energy, than we could ever use up, and that they're more or less instantaneously available everywhere. But then, much of humanity has always known this and argued vociferously that we can base our civilization on these sources rather than on fossils. The fact that they lost the argument seems more to come down to power politics and issues of control, and often simply a lack of imagination than any real physical or technological or economical barriers. The fact of the matter is, renewable energy technologies are nothing new. A brief look at this timeline of the time-space continuum of renewable energy proves that. We can spin the globe in space and time and see how and where and who and when people have gotten their energy since civilization began. It turns out fossil fuels have been known and used, often begrudgingly, for thousands of years. The Chinese were using coal in 2000 BC and developed natural gas 2,200 years ago and refined petroleum for energy use in the 1st century. But apparently people didn't like it much. The heavy carbon chains made it filthy and smelly and poisonous, and people knew it. Most people avoided the dirty fuels. And why not? Renewable energy was also being used in ancient times, and it was cleaner and more abundant. The ancient Egyptians made shallow black pools to create solar hot water. Europeans used vertical water wheels 2 centuries before Christ, and the Islamic era Persians were also using windmills in the 10th century. Long before that, thousands of years before that, ancient Persians and Assyrians were using biogas. And it's doubtful they were the only ones, since everybody knows that you can light farts. And the process of fermentation was well known. Biogas and alcohol were just 2 of the renewable fuels that naturally existed everywhere. Marco Polo talked about biogas when he got back from China in the 13th century, and it did see some attention in Europe. Other biofuels, particularly wood, but also straw and dung, were always used by humanity, and they could also be quite dirty and toxic when burned in campfires and other inefficient combustion designs. But more efficient, cleaner ways to burn them were well known. It's not like our ancestors were stupid. What seems to have happened was a constant up and down and hits and starts in history of people inventing and implementing ways to create an almost paradise on Earth. Just think of the earliest vertical urban farming techniques in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or the peaceful and advanced Minoan and Mycenaean matriarchal cultures of ancient Crete before the volcanic eruption. And then succumbing to warfare and having all that progress and all that capital stock destroyed. Whether it was social or technological innovation, we have plenty of evidence of golden ages where humanity got it right until some event happened that put the power mongers in control. The libraries of Alexandria, for example, which recorded most of the world's progress in science and medicine, were burned by barbarians, and a dark ages ensued, ruled by feudal lords with little interest in allowing enlightenment. But it isn't all dark satanic mills after the collapse of a given golden age, and people picked themselves back up. In terms of renewable energy, of course, the Dutch were going crazy for windmills since the 1500s, and harnessing the wind and the water led to the great age of European exploration by both sailing ships and industry. By the 1700s, it gets even more interesting. The steam engine is invented in 1712, a date that is often regarded as the birthday of the Industrial Revolution. And while the steam engine was developed to most often use the carboniferous legacy of stored sunlight, otherwise known as coal, the steam engine is really only the first of what should be more properly referred to as heat engines, whose simple principle is that an expanding fluid, usually a hot gas, can be used to drive a piston which turns a shaft and spins things like wheels and electric generators. Once the principle was discovered and the first heat engines built, it was just a matter of time before people discovered a huge number of ways to heat up fluids and gases. Fossil fuels weren't necessary, and scientists and tinkerers who didn't have access to them knew it well. In fact, most people had serious concerns about the pollution caused by most fossil fuels and had no interest in working with these filthy substances. Science Photo Library documents the solar furnace developed by French chemist Antoine Lavoisier in the 1770s for use in his experiments. They say, quote, "The furnace focused the heat of the sun using lenses which had a diameter of up to 1.32 meters. The lenses were made from curved sheets of glass with the internal space filled by vinegar. This furnace was intended to replace the need for fuel in experiments that needed heat because of concerns about contamination from the fuel's combustion products. In one experiment, Lavoisier used the furnace to burn diamond in air in a glass jar. By analyzing the combustion products, he was able to show that diamond was comprised solely of carbon." End quote. The concerns about contamination from dirty fossil fuels combustion products is hardly a recent phenomenon, So let's not fool ourselves thinking that the drive for clean fuels is something that can only accompany the famous Kuznets environment curve after some kind of magical inflection point. In fact, we could have had clean development all along. It isn't as if we had to go through a couple of hundred years of filth and pollution to reach the level of civilization we had today. And almost none of the renewable energy sources we are turning toward today, albeit at a snail's pace, are really novel. The 19th century saw an explosion of commercial applications for renewable energy, and almost 100 years after the birth of the steam engine that ran on the pressures created by hot water, in 1816, Robert Stirling invented the first practical example of a closed-cycle air engine that ran on the pressures created by hot air. So politicians could be used to power heated air. The now famous Stirling engine made plumbing for energy production a whole lot safer and easier, and the Stirling engine was so efficient and so silent that it was used much later by the Nazis for some of their U-boats. Once the Brits, Michael Faraday and Joseph Henry, completed their analysis of electromagnetic induction in the 1820s, and the Frenchman Hippolyte Pixii built the first dynamo or electric generator in 1832, the path was paved for a completely clean, healthy future. Electric cars were developed and sold in the 1830s that used electricity from batteries to drive the dynamo to spin the wheels, and generators were built that used the spinning of the dynamo by mechanical means to create electricity. Electricity could power a tremendous range of things, and all that had to be figured out on a case-by-case basis was how to provide the best motive power for turning the dynamo. Hand cranks and bicycles and water wheels and windmills were immediately applied to the task, as were the new heat engines. Battles ensued over the cleanest and most effective ways to make things spin, whether wheels or turbines or pistons, and alcohol fuels, particularly ethanol, became hugely popular. So popular that Henry Ford's first Model T cars, actually Model A cars, ran on it, alcohol, A for alcohol, in 1908, long after other people were driving battery-powered electric vehicles. 1860 had witnessed the first solar power system developed in France to produce steam to drive machinery, and by the end of the century, solar-powered Stirling engines were shown off in Egypt by the French. At the same time, in the late 1800s, the German-American engineer Schumann built a massive concentrating parabolic solar thermal field to provide the energy to pump Nile water and run generators and machinery in Ma'adi in Cairo, Egypt, which became famous in 1911. They built this because politics created a coal supply crisis in England where the dirty fuel came from, and the Egyptians and their international partners wanted to have a competitive textile industry and realized clean, abundant solar power gave them a competitive advantage. The system was dismantled at the beginning of World War I when oil was discovered in the Middle East. Meanwhile, commercial hydroelectric power plants were being built in Wisconsin by 1882, using water to turn these dynamos, and commercial windmills in Cleveland in 1888, with geothermal power plants using the Earth's free steam in 1892 in Idaho. There were so many ways to spin a dynamo. Dynamos weren't the only methods people were exploiting and exploring to create electricity. Sir William Grove invented the hydrogen fuel cell, which we now associate with spaceships and futuristic cars, in 1839, and it started finding immediate applications. Battery technology also started improving rapidly and dramatically, so that by the early 1900s, Edison and Ford joined forces to create the Ford-Edison Electric Car Company, using Edison's marvelous and inexpensive and long-lasting, over 20 years, nickel-iron rechargeable batteries. Hybrid vehicles, particularly the diesel-electric train that used the constant RPM of a generator running on diesel fuel to create electricity to power electric motors running the wheels, were explored in 1903 and put into regular service by 1925. And everybody knew that a diesel engine could be run on straight or used vegetable oil with no processing. Solar cells were discovered by 1876, which witnessed the first demonstration of generating electricity directly from sunlight in a selenium solar cell. And by 1905, Albert Einstein published his theoretical paper explaining and describing the photoelectric effect, a paper that earned him his Nobel Prize. Funny how what he's remembered for is his theoretical work on splitting the atom, which was put to immediate use, while the solar electricity work that he did languished until Bell Labs commercialized solar cells in 1953. Einstein also invented the Einstein refrigerator, not theoretical. Like solar cells, it was a practical invention that used ammonia, or nowadays lithium bromide, and a heat source, biogas, for example, to create cold. The timelines show us that scientific papers were being published proving the greater efficiency and economic promise of alcohol fuels in electric vehicles, and federal laws were being passed in 1924 to try and stop the oil industry from polluting. In fact, a paper in 1896 by Nobel Prize-winning chemist Svante Arrhenius established the science behind climate change and warned humanity of the dire effects of fossil fuels. We've known these problems all along and known their solutions. In fact, the real battle was between those like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, who had a Jeffersonian vision of a decentralized, agrarian-based society where every farm produced not only food, but fuel to power the country, and a centralized, urbanite-controlled industrial society where robber barons manipulating fossil fuels whose supply they can control call the shots. Think Rockefellers. It may be as simple as that. In an alternative universe that had no fossil fuels, it's likely the steampunk era that we read about in science fiction would have begun in earnest. We may well have seen the future Jules Verne described in his lost novel, Paris in the 20th Century, written in 1863, which the famed author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Around the World in 80 Days couldn't get published because his literary agent deemed it too far-fetched. It predicted that by the early 1900s, people would be whisked around a super clean, efficient city in cars that burned nothing at all, and instead used compressed air to move through tubes crisscrossing the city. Only today are these compressed air cars jumping back off the drawing board, but of course it has always been possible. Expansion of fluids or gases, whether due to heating them slowly, as in a Stirling engine or steam engine, or exploding them suddenly, as in a combustion engine, or through the release of compressed air, moves pistons or turbines. What's the problem? Far-fetched? Today, Luxembourg is launching the AirPod 2 compressed air car, which was featured on Shark Tank, a real blast of air from the past. Others of Jules Verne's far-fetched ideas were put into practice quite soon after he wrote them into his novels. Submarines, airships, balloons that could go around the world in 80 days. Of course, they all had military uses. But some of his best ideas were put on the back burner or buried, particularly those that don't have military uses. Consider how, for example, he wanted to power his submarines and his utopian civilization. In his sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Mysterious Island from 1874, Captain Nemo explains his vision for a fuel cell-powered future. Water will one day be employed as fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen of which it is constituted will be used. That's me trying to do James Mason, who played Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Disney movie. Watch it. And then go to Disneyland Paris, where they have a recreation of the steampunk Nautilus. But it wasn't just fictional scientists who saw a clean and materially and energetically abundant future. As John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil began to manipulate the market and drive a monopoly into place around the world ruled by oil, ushered in through the conspiracy of prohibition and the destruction of the electric trolley system of mass transit that dominated America, the great inventor Thomas Edison was quoted saying to Harvey Firestone of Firestone Tires, "We are like tenant farmers chopping down the fence around our house for fuel when we should be using nature's inexhaustible sources of energy, sun, wind, and tide. I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." Thomas Edison is also famous for having said, "If we all did the things we're really capable of doing, we would literally astound ourselves." And that leads me to the conclusion of my ruminations. As we whiz around the global timeline, our time-space continuum line, exploring when and where different inventions and ideas first appeared and how they were received and thought about and implemented and made manifest, or squashed and made invisible. We see that there really is nothing new under the sun, and no real reason, from a scientific or technical point of view, we couldn't already have achieved a sustainable society. When we, if we, at last get there, we will be kicking ourselves, realizing that, as we learn at the end of The Wizard of Oz, we've always had within us all the brains, all the courage, and the heart, to say nothing of the technology, the so-called magic slippers, to get to that home away from home on the distant horizon. The laws of physics and chemistry and biology haven't changed, and most of the things that can save us from disaster were not only known long ago, but are actually very simple. Whether it's solar energy or biogas or wind power or fuel cells or electric cars or heat pumps or even cars that run on garbage, like in Back to the Future, we have to go back to the future and realize that all that is really holding us back in the present is our lack of political courage. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning scientist René Dubos said, "Creating a desirable future requires more than foresight. It demands vision." The time-space continuum timeline of renewable energy helps us use that vision. For as Abraham Lincoln said, "If we could at first know where we've been and whither we are tending, we could better know what to do and how to go about it." Now it's time for you to use this knowledge and make that better world here and now, today. Get to it.